Hi, everybody. I have a mini lecture ready for you that builds on what we were talking about with Lamarck and Erasmus Darwin and Malthus. The next thing that we're going to talk about, so we're going way back when into deep time. It's not really deep time. It's just a few hundred years ago. We're going back to the Victorian age. And so if you recall, we spent some time with Erasmus Darwin, who was working at the end of the 1700s, and Malthus, who was also working at the end of the 1700s and the 1800s. And then also we were talking about Lamarck, who was working at the end of the 1700s and the beginning of the 1800s. And the reason that we're going back to Europe so we're during the Victorian. We'll give you some dates here coming on. The reason that we're in Europe at this time is because Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace are really the first two people to come up with a theory of evolution. And they came up with it independently, even though they were working at the same time and they were from the same country. And when that happens, that suggests that there's something going on in the environment, that there are conversations happening that lead to this sort of critical thinking, this intuitive critical thinking. So I want to talk about that a little bit. So let's talk about what the Victorians were observing. So I love this observation because I had it too. And I had this same feeling. So when I was in 5th grade, I lived in Chicago, and we took a field trip to the Field Museum of Natural History. And they had this exhibit of bones. And it was a cat hand, and a human hand, and a monkey hand, and a whale hand, and a bat hand. And they were all alike. They all looked alike. It was crazy. I stood there and I went, oh my God, look, they're all the same. We all have the same hands. And, I was only in 5th grade, so I don't know what that meant to me, except for that it made my heart go, because it suggested to me that cats and bats and whales, that we are all really the same person. And, I always loved animals. It's why I went into the science that I went into. And to me, it was probably incorrect, but how I interpret it was that we're all really closely related. And if you look at this graph right here that I've got on the board, you can see like this bone right here, how similar it is. We all have this bone. And the same for like the yellow. We all have this bone, different size, different shape, because we have slightly different functions. Whales are swimming, bats are flying, et cetera, et cetera. So what this meant to the Victorians was slightly different than what it meant to me. And it suggested to them that life isn't static, that in fact, life might be modified from each other. So, and if we want to be sophisticated, what that really means when we look at this picture right here is that humans, cats, whales, and bats all share a common ancestor, right? Because that's how we got all these hands. These hands are the same. It's super cool. All right, let me go on to the next slide, but I might have to come back and tell a story about the Victorians. Theoretically, I'm going to go to the next slide. Still theoretically, going back to the next slide. And I've drawn all over it. That's nice. Okay, getting a high quality video tonight. I clearly picked the wrong pen for drawing. So at the same museum at the same age, and I think they've taken this exhibit down now because human babies aren't fit for museum subjects. I see the point there, but certainly when I was in 5th grade, there were babies in jars on the wall. And I thought it was fascinating. I just thought it was fascinating to look how humans went from like this to this. You could see all the parts. So So where am I going with this? Not that dead babies in museums is the topic of conversation we're having here, but the conversation that I want to have here is that this is a true thing. We all have gill slits. Humans have gill slits, like right here, like fish. Clearly, we are not Aquaman now, so we don't keep them, and they only last for a couple of hours during our developmental stage. And it turns out that birds have gill slits, and not surprising, fish have gill slits. And of course, when birds and babies are born, no more gill slits, but it's part of our developmental trajectory that they're there and then they go away. And this became clear to the Victorians because they're finally looking at things under the microscope. And again, what this suggests, the gill slits, I mean, it's a little gross. Eh, I think it's gross. Maybe you don't think it's gross. I don't know. But the thing about the gill slits is that, like the hands, it suggests that birds, fish, and people all had a common ancestor. And it's actually true. We do have a common ancestor. Goes way back in time, actually deep time, unlike the Victorians. Okay, here's another thing about what the Victorians were observing. And I'm sure you've all had this thought, but they were looking at creatures. Okay, so you have to remember, of course, they knew about the Americas since the end of the 1400s, but by the time the 17 and 1800s are coming across, Americans are sort of conquering, that's a bad term, but that's really what was happening, the West. And they're seeing all sorts of New World animals for the first time. And a lot of these animals are looking like the Old World animals that they would have seen in Europe. So, for instance, our friend, I'm not going to use that pen. Oh, let me try this pen. Our friend, oh, yeah, apparently I'm like not checked out on the pen. Here, this guy, the porcupine, because I needed to circle it, otherwise you wouldn't know what I was talking about clearly. Okay, so porcupine has got these quills, and they have a purpose, right? Like nobody's going to eat that pincushion without eating a whole lot of pins. And my scribbled on turtle friend right here, he's wearing his armor, or she, and this macaw or parrot has got a tool on his face, her face, probably her face. So these animals have traits that seem to have a purpose, and this suggests that traits have functions. And typically in the Victorian era, people would have explained it via God made the world with animals to protect themselves, or animals needed tools. The fact that these animals had these functional traits, clearly functional traits, not just maybe functional traits, suggested to the Victorians that an explanation for the occurrence of these traits was required, something more than God. So I think this is funny. So you guys might know that the term Big Bang Theory, Big Bang, it came from a meeting where the first guy, I can't remember his name, was trying to describe the beginning of time. And his hypothesis went, once upon a time. So this is super deep time. Once upon a time, like before there was anything, there was nothing. And then there was stuff. So he's explaining it, probably not with the hands and the sound effects, probably with math and chalkboards and derivatives and whatever. I don't know. I have any clue. And the audience is just scoffing, right? Because what a ridiculous idea. You go from nothing to everything like overnight. It turns out that's true. But the guy in the audience, and these were all men, the guy in the audience says, wait a minute. So you're saying there was nothing, and then there was this Big Bang, and then there was something. This Big Bang theory is ridiculous. And the guy who's giving the lecture is like, yeah, I guess we'll call it the Big Bang theory. And of course, Obamacare is like that, right? Obama didn't call it Obamacare. He called it the Affordable Care Act. And then his detractors are like, oh, Obamacare. And Obama's like, yeah, sure, we'll call it Obamacare. And it's still called Obamacare, also the Affordable Care Act. But it was meant as kind of an insult. And that's how we got the word evolution, kind of an insult. So the detractors for the idea of evolution, um, it, they were like, "Oh, you believe that organic structure had changed over time, that things evolved?" Ha ha ha! And it stuck. As many insults do. So be careful with your insults. Maybe make sure they're actually insulting, if that's your point. I mean, I'm kind of glad that evolution stuck. I like that one. Actually, I like Obamacare and the Big Bang Theory too. Okay, wait, before I go on to the next one. Um, man, I wish I hadn't scribbled on that side. Let's go back to where we can't see the scribbles. Okay, scribbles belong here. Let's stay here. Okay, I want to tell you something, a true story about the Europeans during this time and why this is actually cooler than you might think it is. Or maybe you are like me and you're such a nerd and you think this is super cool, because I do. Okay, so way back when there was a Manny, true story, was a Manny, and there was a German royal guy whose wife had died. And by royal guy, he was a soldier, and he wasn't like a prince or prince. He was like a baron or something like that. So he had to go and fight wars and go to meetings and stuff like that. And his wife died, leaving him two little kids. And the dad was like, "Yeah, well, need a nanny." He didn't want a girl nanny. He wanted a boy nanny. So he got himself a Manny. And the dad wanted his kids raised with scientific reasoning. And so the Manny, they decided, wait, I got to stop my story for a minute. So microscopes have been around for a long time, like a really long time, like Galileo time, right? Because Galileo was using a really shitty telescope to look at the sky. So a microscope is just a inside out telescope, been around for a long time. But when they were first invented, the only people who used them would have been the religious people in Europe. They would have been the monks and probably not the nuns. Probably the nuns are busy doing everybody's laundry. Oh, that's not true. We just found out that nuns were doing some of the manuscript illustration for some of those beautiful middle-aged um, annotated calligraphy pages. I digress. So way back when, the microscopes were only owned by monks. But by the Victorian age, rich people had them. And they would have parties. Come over on Friday night. Let's look at some shit under the microscope. You guys are laughing because you're like, we'd rather play Rocket League, which is fun in its own right. But before you have Rocket League and Fortnite, you're stuck with looking under a microscope. so this guy, this Manny, he takes his kids out into the swamp in the backyard, and they get some water and they look at some shit under a microscope, and they find hydras. Okay, if you don't know what a hydra is, look right now. Okay, so a hydra, I should have a picture of a hydra, although I would have just scribbled all over it. So hydra is like this, it's a multicellular organism, but it's pretty small. Like you can see it with your naked eye, but you can't really see it unless you're looking under a microscope. And it's got like a tube body, and it's got like tentacles hanging out. And so in the way of little boys and big boys across the world, they chopped off a leg. Okay, and the hydra's like, ow! But then the hydra's like, okay, let's grow it back. So the hydra, like all hydra do, grew its leg back. And the Manny and the kids were like, oh my God, it grew its leg back. And so they, it's a true story. And so you could fact check me if I could remember anybody's name in this story. But maybe I've given you enough details, you can go find the names. The Manny, he's like, I can't believe this leg grew back. And so he contacts the local university and he says, listen, man, you find a hydra and you chop off its legs, the legs grow back. And the university's like, yeah, right. Send us some hydra. We'll chop off the legs and verify this shit. So they spent like 2 years trying to mail a hydra. I can't make this shit up. Well, it turns out that you can put a hydra in a tube But if you put a cap on it, it suffocates. And so because you can't FedEx it, right? So you got to put it in a saddlebag on a horse to go 20 miles, which is long enough to suffocate a hydra, apparently. So you have to put a cap on it and then it suffocates, or you put no cap on and then you're on a horse, so it's splashing out and you lose the hydra in the water. It's like the bath baby in the bathwater. And so it took them 2 years to invent the cork. It's really true. And so they invent the cork, and by this time everybody in the university is like busy and forgotten the importance of the, the regenerating hydra. But it becomes a science experiment that everybody, all the rich who have a microscope, they all go and look into the water and find some hydras and chop off legs and grow them back. Okay, not in England. I think we're in France, but maybe Germany. I can't. I know that the dad was German, but I can't remember what country we're in. But I think we're in France. So everybody for an entire summer, everybody is like chopping off legs of hydras and watching them grow back. And the reason that they were astounded by this is because if anybody could have the power of regeneration, it should be humans, not these goddamn hydras who are like swamp monsters, right? Because humans, men, are made in the image of God, and if God could have given the gift of regeneration to anybody, he would have given it to men, people. And the clergy were like, no, the hydra is not regenerating. But across the land in France, people are chopping off and looking again under the microscope and verifying. And of course, no matter how many times you do it, it's always going to work. England, they forbade it. Okay, so England was a little more staunchly religious than the rest of Europe, a little more dogmatic in its approach to religion. And England was the place that they said, yeah, where that's you can't do that experiment. It's an insult to God to do that experiment. So why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because this is the gossip. You know, like right now, I don't know where you guys get your news. Like I just heard, hopefully you're listening to something like NPR, but maybe you're getting it on Facebook or whatever. But the rumors of the day were beginning to question, and this is across Europe. This is not just in England where Darwin and Wallace were, because the story about the Hydra is from France. The story of the time is people are starting to question this idea, this Victorian idea. Oh, we can get like queuing it up. I wish I hadn't scribbled all over everything. This is a joke. I mean, but this joke summarizes Victorian thinking. Okay, and there's our dates for Victorian. So we're talking the 1830s to 1901 is the Victorian age. Okay, this is God right here. And he's making the world, and he's adding birds and insects and krill, reptiles and trees and amphibians, medium skin, light skin people, dark skin people. And just to make it interesting, he's adding jerks. The reason that this is funny, I mean, because he's adding jerks, but this really does summarize how the Victorians saw the world, that God created species and they were unchanging. And the world was perfect in the way that it was. And, you know, God didn't let any sparrow die that he didn't mean to let it die, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I am telling you this not because I'm mocking religion or God, but I'm telling you this because religion influenced the way people were thinking. Because we are just a product of our environment. The way you're thinking is depending on your environment and what's in the chatter right now in the news. Like you guys, there are people amongst you maybe who are thinking about Black Lives Matter for the first time because that's the chatter that's going on, or the Me Too movement because that's the chatter, or the Occupy Wall Street. That was a thing. We are just the way that we see the world is colored by the politics, the culture that's around us. And so where I'm going with this is that the culture going around us, they were undergoing kind of a culture war across Europe. And that culture war had to do with this idea that God created the world perfect in every way. And that's flying in the face of publications like that Malthus was putting out and that Lamarck was putting out, but also it was flying in the face of what people saw in their living rooms when they were chopping off hydra tentacles or legs or whatever you call them. And it was certainly when people realized that um, hands look the same across species, you have this moment of thinking, well, was God super uncreative? Which is kind of where the British were going with that. To maybe God didn't exactly make it the way we were thinking about it, which is that's a hypothesis. So anyway, these are important ideas that were swimming uh, around the culture when Darwin and Wallace were working. Okay, in the next video, you're going to meet Darwin and Wallace, who are super cool. See ya.